We've introduced the notion of displacement, and we've started to wonder what circumstances could make it adaptive. Let's remind ourselves what is needed. We're looking for settings and parameters that can be adjusted out of context, and then those settings preserved so that they become useful within context. So, to help us think about this, let's look at another scenario. Supposing some kind of choreography is developed in a particular geographical situation. There it is. And there are creatures. It's developed in a particular geographical setting that's remained relatively unaltered, let's suppose. And so that the many iterations of a particular choreography has had a chance to develop, become quite sophisticated. So into that setting, now suppose a behaviour arises and develops where the creatures begin to actually modify the environment in some way, moving things around in such a way, but modifying the environment in such a way that they also indirectly modify their choreography. So that by modifying the environment at one time when they do it, and then at another time when they're engaged in the choreography that involves the environment, it's modified it. So this gives them a kind of a handle, we could say approximate handle, on the choreography. So, however it comes about, we've been a bit vague there, but however it does come about, the development of behaviours that modify the environment within which a choreography is enacted provides an indirect way to modify the parameters governing the interpretation of a choreography, and thereby giving rise to a chunk of cognitive machinery with parameters that can be configured in one circumstance and then referenced in another. So this is exactly what we need for long-range anticipation. What we've arrived at is a chunk of cognitive machinery with parameters that are configured in one circumstance and referenced in another. But furthermore, let's suppose that the interventions required, for whatever reason, are substantial, which could be shifting very big and heavy things around, or it could be excavating, but whatever that is difficult and takes time and requires a joint that's more beyond the scope of one individual acting alone, requiring joint enterprise. Taking significant amount of time and energy. So this type of scenario creates an evolutionary pressure on the chunk of anticipative cognitive machinery to respond. Like the question then becomes, like if it requires a lot of effort by all of them, is how is it decided what to do? one creature might begin to do something, another one might join in, but they might try to stop it or do something else. So therefore, patterns of cues must arrive, patterns of behavior that modulate or modify. It becomes a kind of decision-making process and a communicative process of what actually ends up happening. So we have a chunk of cognitive machinery that holds a pattern common to members of the group, a pattern of the choreography and a pattern of the way the choreography can be changed. And it requires social interaction to modify it. And then it becomes available for reference during times of actions. Now, these kind of social interactions that give rise to joint modification of the environment are a type of proto-language. So I suppose I could go back to the question of what type of this modification of the environment, what kind of scenario could that be? So I'll just look at that. I'm going to present an example with river levels, just as a sort of example. Not that this is necessarily how it would happen, but it's for illustration. Supposing over a very long period of time a river has a certain level that remains more or less constant, and the creatures adapt their behaviour to that geographical fact. Sort of relying on it in a way. But then, supposing after many, many iterations of evolution, something in the environment changes and the river level begins to go down, but at the same time the creatures sort of stumble across maybe ways of putting things in the river that blocks it up, so the flow's slowed, and for their purposes it retains the same level as it had before. So this, what I'm calling this, is recapitulation. Recapitulation is interventions which preserve the situation as it is, as they've got used to it, when it begins later on to change. Recapitulation. And so then as time goes by, maybe the conditions change more extreme, but once they've got the idea of modifying things, then they can introduce more ambitious interventions to retain the recapitulation. So that might be one example, there might be others, of a way in which a behaviour of modifying an environment could come about. That's all we're saying, really. So going back to our creatures here, modifying their environment and the interactions between them as they do so, it's a crude type of proto-language when you consider that it involves large-scale work on the environment to bring it out. So let's go back to, now that this cognitive machinery is available to them, let's go back to displacement and consider scaling as a precursor to representation. So in our displacement scenario, the creatures found themselves in a situation that was in some way reminiscent of another situation, in that case where they were sort of hiding behind things and where one of them could peep over. So that's the displacement. Now they've, through what we said just now, have obtained cognitive machinery to modify choreographies by modifying the environments. But now with scaling, there's that old thing, is that a big thing far away kind of looks to the retina the same as a small thing nearby. And you can sort of draw triangles and all that. And so that is a question of perspective. And what this means, of course, is that there's a possibility for displacement of the environment modifying behavior, where, you know, supposing that they were planning to, planning is not really the right word, that they were engaged in shifting a big boulder far away looks like a small pebble nearby. And so with displacement, you could stumble on a behavior where the creatures start to move smaller items around, because it triggers off the same behaviors due to scaling as the bigger ones would. And so this is, you know, this offers the possibility of a sort of representation where the representation is really cognitively the same as the actual thing, but it's triggered off by a different but related situation. And then the same kind of social engagement, the toing and froing, the kind of combination of cooperation and competition that determines the final outcome, that this one, say, wants to push it over there, but this one wants to push it over there, and this one wants to join in with this one or that one to push it. They can sort of do that with scaled versions, but if that has the same impact on adjusting parameters, then in a way that's even better, because you've got the possibility of trying out different scenarios at lower cost than having to actually go out and do it for real. So what we've ended up with is the cognitive machinery required for long-range anticipation, which is ways of adjusting parameters in one situation then referencing them in another, and we envisage ways that this can begin to be modified and adjusted in a kind of proto language, we could say. So this is all very, very speculative, and I suppose we must ask ourselves, well, what if something like this was true? What would we expect to see? Well, one thing we would expect to see if we looked into the brains of creatures, timing mechanisms. Timing mechanisms which support latency. And there might be ways both to investigate them, how they actually work, the chemistry, and also by conducting experiments, by displaying sort of different kinds of pictures to creatures, to deduce the latency periods. That might be possible. Another thing we might expect to see, if something like all this is true, is that there might be memory changes that occur due to general environmental changes, but then other kinds of memory changes that are related to environmental changes that are part of a choreography. And so, can we distinguish? Can we distinguish memory related to choreography plus environment? So we would expect to see a difference somehow. Another thing we could look out for is if something like this is true and the mechanism for anticipation and proto-language resulted from physically shifting things around in the real environment, can we find a residual link? Run out of paper. Can we find a residual link between motor activations and verbal activations? And also, does this differentiate between private operations within an individual and social operations, such as the joint enterprise of moving the environment, shifting the environment together? What about the business of latency and feeling hidden? Different animals, do they actually know they're hidden? If they are hidden, or if they think they're hidden, how hidden are they? Can animals be tested to determine the extent to which they know they're hidden? So, for instance, what if you take an animal and put a hat on it? Does the creature know that the hat is not hidden? Does it know the hat can be seen or not seen? How does it react to things like that? It's possible that some of the things can't be found. For instance, if we look at the example of the transition from steam to diesel power. I remember once going to a steam fair and seeing a traction engine, a steam traction engine that had a diesel engine fitted onto it, and it just looked like an ugly monstrosity. It represented the transition from one form of power to another, and was neither one thing nor another, and would be quickly superseded by a proper tractor if it was or a lorry. So transitional arrangements also in nature, you could expect that maybe they don't last long, even though they provide the link between one set of possibilities and another, because then later on subsequent refinements might be so much better than the transitional arrangement that it quickly supersedes it, so it might be hard to find. Another footnote is, of course, we tend to worry about finding it difficult to learn to remember things, but adjustments to the parameters of memory are actually very, very dangerous. If it was easy for a creature to modify its own parameters with respect to perception and memory, if that were to go wrong, you could just kind of lose it completely, lose any sensible connection with your normal connection to your instincts, to your ability to read the environment. The early Apollo missions had literally hardwired memories with ferrite rings threaded onto wires with the key parameters, so that the astronauts, if they pressed a button wrongly or whatever, they couldn't just wipe out but on the other hand, you need to preserve intermediate values. So that's another thing to look out for. We can suppose that a choreography is supported by an underlying pattern that is fixed, and that then it's configured by specific geographic experience, or perhaps there's an overlay that configures that with weights. But we would expect to see a similar thing, something that's fixed, and then something that is also overlaid on that can be modified, so that it's hard to kind of totally wipe out your memory connection. And it makes sense that it's hard to change memories. Anyway, these specific details are way beyond the scope of this talk, so thank you for your interest.